Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone, to our very timely session tonight on the situation in Ukraine, which is hosted together by Liberal International British Group, Liberal Democrat European Forum, and the Paddy Ashton Forum tonight. So welcome, everyone. My name is Elena van Wiese. I am the chair of Liberal International British Group. I'm also the vice chair of Liberal Democrats European Group and a former member of the European Parliament, where I had the immense privilege of serving as vice chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee and amongst other things have had the immense pleasure of looking at Ukraine and particularly at human rights issues in Ukraine. So I very much look forward to today's discussion, for which we have some very illustrious guests speaking to us tonight. Very few points on housekeeping. For those of you who dialed in, please be aware tonight's meeting will be recorded. I would be very grateful if you could go on mute. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat. So we already have a number of questions which were sent to us beforehand, but there is still room for more questions, and we really value our questions, and we'll try to address all of them after we heard from our speakers. So before we start going into more detail on Ukraine, I would very much like Robert Woodthorpe-Brown to say a few words in his function as chair of the Paddy Ashton Forum. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irina. In 6 days' time, Paddy Ashton, or Lord Ashton of Norton-sub-Hampden, would have been 82 years old. It is fitting that the forum, which bears his name, should be working with the British group of Liberal International to discuss the current tensions and indeed threats to European peace, given the late Paddy's role in conflict resolution in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Indeed, such was his reputation that the United Nations, with the backing of the USA and the European Union, had all agreed that he should be put in charge of resolving the conflict in Kazakhstan. His appointment was blocked at the last moment by President Karzai and Afghan leaders, who had learned that Paddy was stern in dealing with corruption and incompetence, and that they themselves had much to fear. We can only wonder what if. Were he still to be in the House of Lords, he would have been vocal in calling out the current threat to peace in Europe and critical of many of the players on both sides. I am pleased that the Paddy Ashton Forum has been able to assist in this evening's event. I would like to thank both Chris Gleadle and Isabel Pusher for the arrangements, including the technical aspects of Zoom hosting. I understand the recording will be available on both websites and that of Liberal International too. And by the way, it's the Q&A that we should be putting our questions in, not the chat arena. Thank you very much indeed, and let's have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Robert. And yes, indeed, the Q&A, not the chat, and I will try to keep an eye on both. So without further ado, I'm very happy that we have got guests speaking to us tonight who are much more knowledgeable about the situation in Ukraine than I am. I do, however, feel that this is a topic close to my heart, not only because of my background in human rights, but also because, as you may have guessed, my first name is Russian, and so is my heritage. And I have traveled to Ukraine and indeed Russia extensively. I am, as I think all of us are, extremely worried about the situation. When we set up this session tonight, when we talked about the topics a few months ago, we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know whether there would be some form of open aggression, or on the contrary, whether we would all be able to breathe a sigh of relief. I'm afraid neither has really happened. We haven't seen the worst case scenario yet, nor have we seen some form of detente. We are in some form of limbo and have been kept, I believe, on purpose in this sense of limbo. And so many different things have been said and written from a geopolitical perspective, from an economic perspective, which I think we shouldn't forget a diplomatic perspective, and so many different actors are involved in this current conflict. So sadly, I have to say this event is still very, very timely. Sadly, we still have a huge amount of open questions and very few answers. But I would like to really pass now to the expert on this. And first of all, I'm very, very happy to welcome Odysseia Dicevich, who is the head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House and a research fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program. And Odysseia will give us a sort of basic introduction, and then obviously her valuable insights from the perspective of Chatham House. Odysseia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thanks for hosting me. And it's indeed very unsettling and anxious times, you know, precarious really times, because we don't know from today to tomorrow how situation may escalate. And, you know, I originally myself come from Ukraine, the country that is indeed suffering from a grave security vacuum. It's quite surreal that it is Russia who speaks to the fact of feeling insecure, whereas Ukraine's borders were violated by force, more than 1.5 million were displaced, grave human rights violations were performed on the occupied territories of Crimea and Donbass, and it is Russia who speaks as a victim, not as a perpetrator. This is the, you know, the almost dystopian reality we are living in. And unfortunately, the snowball of this dystopia and lie continues, because what we see at the moment, and this is the analysis literally between this weekend and today, is that Russia prepares to imitate humanitarian disaster. And, you know, as a result of the fabricated attacks by Ukrainian armed forces on civilians, we are talking this in the center of Europe, right? On civilians, to stage a new military invasion in Ukraine. Russian officials are using very disturbing language in the chamber of the UN Permanent Security Council, pronouncing words like genocide of Russian speakers in eastern part of Ukraine. And I'm sure if Irina was working on human rights violations, it's Ukraine, just to remind our audience, has never had a civil war, has never had any territorial disputes, has never had really any suppression of multi-ethnic communities that exist on the territory of Ukraine, and they range from Bulgarians to Romanians to Poles to Jews to Hungarians, you name it, Greeks, Germans, Ukrainians and Russians. So it's a real disturbing fact. And you know, from the events that I see the way they are evolving, my gut feeling is that Russia will recognize the independence of partially occupied territories in the east, but here's a very important but, in the borders of administrative units of oblast as they were pre-2014, which give them a right to stage further territorial claims onto these new Ukrainian territories, and they will use the proxy formations that they've armed to a large degree to advance and attack Ukraine. It's likely that it will not just be an attack from the east of Ukraine, but it may be accompanied by military pressure from the south in the Black Sea and the north in Belarus. I'm saying this, of course, only based on open intelligence, but if we read correctly US intelligence messaging, it looks like Putin is moving along the line of escalation, and he is performing exactly the steps that would allow him for a joint forces operation against Ukraine. So honestly, to say that what is Putin's goal? It's to subjugate or wreck Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot of pondering whether a rational man would do and act like that. But I don't think Putin is a very rational man. I don't know how many of you have watched today the the televised National Security Council, just to say that it was pre-recorded, but it was presented as live. And just to say that it also looked like a bit of a dystopia King Lear, who was, commanding his entourage to deliver messages that were predetermined. And a slip of a tongue from the chief spy of Russia, Naryshkin, who said that, yes, we are ready to annex, basically, these territories into the Russian proper, not just recognize their independence, is also telling about what Russia is thinking overall. So just to say that Russia pushed us into the false narrative by making a claim that it has legitimate security concerns where it doesn't, and that NATO enlargement is a threat to Russia, whereas Russian generals perfectly know that Russia has conventional superiority on land and honestly in air on the eastern flank of NATO. And it is Russian posturing that is threatening NATO much more than the NATO itself threatening Russia. So all of this is here to basically, as it was put by my colleague who understands Russia quite well in Chatham House, when Crimea was annexed, Putin took Russia off its knees. Now Putin wants to put the West on its knees. That's why these security treaties that were proposed to United States, NATO, included basically an attempt to stop NATO enlargement, to get US out of Eastern Europe, to decouple EU and US strategic security partnership that is performed through NATO, and to, and here I would like to propose a new term, because we are talking about spheres of influence. And I think spheres of influence in foreign policy are quite legitimate things. France has a sphere of influence where, because of colonial legacy, some people speak French, some people may have different attitudes towards France. But what Russia wants is a sphere of coercion. Russia wants to control policymaking in the countries of its neighborhood. It's not enough for Russia, for Ukrainian people to just listen to Russian music or to read Dostoevsky. This is not about actually sphere of influence. And that is why I think that the narrative about neutrality and non-bloc Ukraine is not going to get out of this predicament, because it's not after neutral Ukraine that Putin is after. Look at Belarus. Belarus is basically swallowed by Russian Federation. And this is what Putin sees for the future of Ukraine, for it to be swallowed. So this is the scene we are dealing in. And of course, our room for maneuver is quite narrow, but I think there is still a way to proceed. And that is, I think, through obviously deterrence, diplomacy, and determination. I think, Irina, you mentioned how nerve-wracking this uncertainty is. I am afraid that this will remain with us for a while. I hope midterm, but that midterm may last, and we are, pre-positioning for this rivalry between Putin's regime, and here I think honestly, Putin's decisions and his regime are not in the interest of the Russian people. And the rest of the democratic world that sees, honestly, the principle of sovereignty of nations as the cornerstone of foreign policy. This is the basic thing we are now talking about. So, of course, by diplomacy, from Ukraine's perspective, the most important thing is the unity of the West. And by the West, I mean G7, NATO, EU, United States. Because Russia exactly calculates that Ukraine is more important for Russia than it is important for the West. But I think the recent diplomatic effort showed us that Ukraine is important and the world stands by Ukraine. Different countries express it in different ways, but nobody questions Ukraine's sovereignty. I think we should not reward escalation by a diplomatic, satisfaction, because I think diplomacy is here to deliver very serious messages, not to give Putin a picture on television how he's the great leader bullying the world and getting what he wants. And I think that on the deterrence side, deterrence comes mainly through helping Ukraine defend itself, and that is providing necessary military assistance. That also comes in helping Ukraine protect on the security, cyber security front, because it's not just about land. It's also about countering Russian toxic disinformation in the countries where Russia uses its resources through social media and Russia-sponsored television like RT to tell the true story about what is going on in Europe. And this is the role of all of us, from political parties to think tanks, to put the facts on the table, because that has a deterrent effect. I think providing Ukraine economic assistance is very important, because each week, even of threat of aggression, cost billions to Ukrainian economy. The president of Ukraine was speaking between 1 to 2 billion a week. EU has provided 1.2 microfinancial assistance, 1.2 billion, but that is not gonna last for too long. So we have to think, understanding that this is long-term, for long-term also financial support. Again, President Zelensky in Munich called for Ukraine Resilience Fund that would perhaps help ensure political risk, geopolitical risks for companies that remain to work in Ukraine, and build resilience of communities that will be directly impacted, for example, by this Azov and Black Sea blockade, where the ports will not be able to operate properly. And then on determination, that is more of Ukraine's own story. It's of course, for Ukraine, it's interesting because there has been a real revolution where Ukraine belongs in Ukraine. And that is not just a fantasy of political elites. It's very much the emotion of majority of the Ukrainian population. They believe that they belong to the European family of EU member states. NATO membership is getting more and more traction. And only, for example, 12% of Ukrainians see NATO as a threat, something that is dominant as a narrative in Russia. And Ukrainians are quite sober about, you know, when their times come, that they should count on their own forces to defend Ukraine. 56% say, in case Ukraine is under aggression, it will have to be Ukrainians defending Ukraine. 35% believe that it would come from NATO and EU support. 25% say it will come from the US support. So you could clearly see where that Ukraine is quite serious about standing up for itself. So, you know, and also just to finish on the, because there's obviously a lot of emotion these days, but let's remember that in 2014, when Ukrainians were waving those European flags, the main emotion there was hope. Ukrainians believed that there is better life, and that better life belongs, you know, in the European civilized rule-based democracy. Russia wants to clamp down on that hope, partially because Russia itself is very much a besieged country where honestly all Russians hope that it's not going to get worse. This is the main emotion in Russia. And Putin abuses that emotion of fear by, you know, dragging his country into war for these new imperial goals that I have described at the beginning. And I think, you know, again, to say what President Zelensky said in Munich, Ukraine is the shield of Europe. And Ukrainians believe this is the case. The question is whether Europe believes this is the case and how far Europe will go to strengthen that shield that protects us all today against very disruptive and aggressive Russia. Thank you so much.
Alicia, thank you very, very much for this overview. And I'm sure that has provoked a lot of questions in the audience, but if you can patient yourself until the end of all of the contributions, I promise we will have sufficient time for questions then. I would like to welcome next Julie Smith, Baroness Smith of Newnham, whom many of you will know is our Liberal Democrat spokesperson for defense in the House of Lords. Julie is also a professor of European politics at the University of Cambridge. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irina, and thank you to Orsia for giving us such a passionate introduction to the events in Ukraine and the situation that we're in. I come to this as essentially, as Irena said, the Lib Dem defence spokesperson in the Lords, but my academic background is on the politics of the European Union. And many years ago now, I worked also at Chatham House, where I ran the European programme. And at the time, it was very much that time of hope when the countries of Central and Eastern Europe were aspiring to membership of the Western institutions. And at the time that I was running the programme, there was a sense that 3 countries might be about to join the European Union, that those that were most advanced, Poland, Hungary and Estonia, not necessarily most advanced in all ways, but seemed to be preparing for almost Westernization. And at the time, NATO was saying, yes, much better that the European Union enlarge. It's so much easier for the EU to enlarge. And the EU was saying, don't be ridiculous. It's much easier for NATO to expand because you can simply make a decision and we have all these very complex institutions. And of course, what we saw was the expansion of both the European Union and of NATO. But at the time, from a Western perspective, it felt very much as if the Western institutions were opening up to a set of countries that aspired to the same values that we had long espoused. And I don't think there was a sense of seeking to expand in order to challenge Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. There wasn't a sense of expansionism in that way, but rather of opening up to countries that sought to join. And I thought I remembered from my time at Chatham House having a conversation with somebody from probably the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, but we were talking about NATO expansion and how, well, maybe in 30 years' time, even Russia could be part of NATO. And I thought perhaps I'd invented this, that it was some vague memory, the false memory. But reading the newspapers yesterday, I was reminded that no, indeed, Putin had said, well, you know, NATO, who knows, maybe. Now, this is 20 years ago, but I think what we're so often told now is that somehow NATO has been expanding in a way that's aggressive, that we are trying to move into the Russian sphere of influence. And I don't think that is right. I think Putin is in many ways trying to rewrite history as well as invent the present. So whereas Orsia said about the toxic misinformation, there is also a way in which for a period after the collapse of communism in Europe, it felt as if we perhaps were singing, not quite from the same hymn sheet, but we weren't actually at potential loggerheads with each other. But Ukraine was always in a somewhat different position from the 3 Baltic states or from the Visegrad countries in terms of never being quite as clear about where its vocation lay. And I have only been to Ukraine once when I was running the European programme at Chatham House, to an event in Lviv, which I'd been asked to organise. The Foreign Office had provided some money, and it was to look at British, Polish, Ukrainian relations. So it was looking at border issues. We were looking at ways of essentially using soft power. But what was always very clear was that whereas some countries said, we want to join the EU and NATO, and we'll do everything we need to do to reform to join, the Ukrainian position was always a little bit more measured. There would be times when there were calls for joining. And once we said, but actually these are the Copenhagen criteria, this is what you need to do to join, there was a little bit of backtracking. And so Ukraine has, from a Western perspective, in some ways been caught in the middle. And is it a buffer zone? Yes, but it also now feels as if it is in many ways caught almost in a hostage position. And Robert was saying earlier about if Paddy was still with us in the House of Lords, then he would be very vocal, and indeed he would. But I was in Bosnia at the end of last year in Srebrenica, and the widows and mothers who'd lost their children at that time were so keen to come and talk to me and say, Paddy was so wonderful. And in some ways, we need somebody who could actually lead negotiations and serious diplomacy, because what nobody wants is for us to end up in an unintended war between West and East, where we end up engaging in something that trips over a line. And I think what we need to be doing is looking for ways to negotiate. But by way of preparation for this evening, I was looking at an article by Ulcia's colleagues at Chatham House, Duncan Allen and Katja Walchuk, talking about Minsk II, saying that can't work because actually we've got to accept Ukrainian sovereignty, and the Minsk II, sorry, was one of those words. Once you start missaying it, Minsk II, you actually need to acknowledge the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty. So in that sense, from a Liberal Democrat House of Lords perspective, then there is quite a lot of what the government here is saying that we would agree with. And we are delighted that they have finally said, we'll get rid of the golden visa for Russians, or for anybody, but that is, we think, important and something we've been calling for a long time. Obviously, the British government has been giving military support, giving support to Ukraine, but also bolstering our forces and the enhanced forward presence in Estonia. But I think we need to be looking much more at what we can be doing with the United States and our other NATO allies to be looking for diplomatic solutions, because there can't be any good military solution to what's going on. But equally, we can't turn a blind eye. And in many ways, that's what the West has been doing for the last 8 years. And if we want to understand one of the problems of turning a blind eye or not acting appropriately, look at what happened when America walked out of Afghanistan. Essentially, everything we've done for the last 20 years began to disappear. And who benefited from that? Russia and China. And Russia, I think, has been emboldened by that. And we need to be very clear that the West will stand up for the international rules-based order. That with Joe Biden, we've got a better opportunity of doing that than we had with Trump. But we have got to look very much for diplomacy, but also, I think, for very strong sanctions, because otherwise Putin will carry on doing what he's doing. And that's not an acceptable solution for anybody. So I will draw to a close there and hope that with our 2 more speakers, we'll still have a bit of time for questions.
Julie, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm very delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Bernard Guetta, who is my former colleague in the European Parliament, member of Renew Europe for France. And Bernard and I were together on the Foreign Affairs and Human Rights Committees. He is still there, I am not. And he is also a member of the Delegation Committee. Bernard, I'm sure you remember when we welcomed Alex Sentsov to the Human Rights Committee, who was the Sakharov Prize winner the year before I entered the European Parliament in 2018, but could not pick up his prize because he was incarcerated at the time as a Ukrainian dissident in a Russian prison. He was freed and he was there a year later to pick up his prize. And I will never forget the harrowing witness statement that he made to us in the subcommittee about how he was treated. So that's just a reminder of the situation long before it became as acute as it is now. Bernard, I very much look forward to your contribution. Over to you.
So thank you, Irina. I have to tell you that I miss you a lot, and that I and the other members of Renew Europe miss not only you, but the entire UK in the European Union. But let's forget that. Let's speak about the situation. And I have to tell you first that the news we just heard, that Mr. Putin decided to recognize the two so-called independent region of eastern Ukraine as independent states is a very, very bad news, because now we don't have anything to negotiate with Mr. Putin. It was possibly, it would have been the first step to initiate a real negotiation about security and cooperation in Europe, I mean in the continent, Europe. And now it's over. Now I have to tell you that I wish that in this situation, the Western countries will decide quickly real sanctions against Russia, because it's more than enough to decide sanctions against Mr. Putin. So the situation is very, very dark. I have to tell you that. And I understand that everybody shares, unfortunately, this opinion. But nevertheless, as a member of the European Parliament, I would like to tell you also that 4 years ago, we had to thank Mr. Trump for rebuilding the European Union, and today we have to bless Mr. Putin for having created the first real political unity of the Union rebuilt by his friend Donald Trump. This is a very strange situation, because two evils, completely different but equally frightening, had helped Europe to affirm itself as a political actor of the world stage. And if you are, I guess that a lot of you will be skeptical about this assertion, but just think about the new situation in the European Union. European defense, common industrial policies, borrowing money in common to invest in common are not anymore taboos in the European Union for 2-3 years. This is a completely different situation. And now we have also more and more the same views on Putin, on Africa, and even on China. Yes, we are, don't be skeptical. Yes, we are entering the third moment of European unity, the political unity after the common market and our common currency. Understand me, please, it will be very difficult. We will have a lot of very tough battles between all the 27 members of the European Union, but nevertheless, and precisely because we are entering this new moment of the European unity, we will have those battles, but those battles will be, this is a paradox, but this is a fact also, will be the sign of a real evolution in the European Union toward a political union. This is the first reason on my eyes to see a light at the end of the tunnel, but there is a second reason not to be too pessimistic in those very, very hard times. Mr. Putin is not stronger and stronger, but weaker and weaker. He is more and more dangerous and unpredictable because he's weaker and not because he's stronger. But why do I say that? For many reasons. The first one is that the young Russian people, the people under 40 years old, or maybe even 45 years old, who didn't know the Soviet Union as, at least as adult people, as grown up, those people have no any nostalgia of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union, and they do regard countries like Ukraine, Belarus, or Georgia as foreign countries, very close to Russia, certainly, but foreign countries. And so Mr. Putin lost in the last, I don't know, 5, 7, maybe 10 years, at least 5 years. He lost the support he had 20 years ago when he became the president of the Russian Federation, because at that time there was in his country a real nostalgia for the empire and a real national humiliation. So Mr. Putin is less and less popular every month. Every month he is losing 1, 2, 3 points, but is less and less popular every month because his country changed completely during the last, and in fact, the last 30 years after the end of Soviet Union. The second reason why Mr. Putin is weaker and weaker is that he alienated the closest country to Russia. I mean by that Belarus and Ukraine. Belarus and Ukraine used to be rather friendly to Russia, used to speak Russian more than Ukrainian, and certainly more than Belarusian. And Mr. Putin, instead of try to seduce those countries, instead of trying to keep them closer to Russia, alienated them by, we know how, by the annexation of Crimea, by exporting war in eastern Ukraine, and by supporting the dictatorship of Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus. I do remember, as the member of the European Parliament, the main figures of the Belarusian opposition. At the beginning of their fight, they kept telling us in Brussels, we want to try to find a compromise with Putin. We want him to understand that we don't have anything against Russia or even against him. We want a new president, more liberal, more Democrat, respectful of our democratic will, but not at all hostile to Russian interest. And instead of listening to that, instead of taking this opportunity, Mr. Putin supported Lukashenko and made the Belarusian people to turn to the Western countries, to the European Union, even to NATO, and to forget their historical links with Russia. And so Mr. Putin may be ready to go into war with Ukraine. He may be regarded as a strong man, but I'm sorry to say so, he's not a strong man. He's a complete blind person. And to tell the truth, don't repeat that. He's a complete idiot. He's a complete idiot. Because he destroyed, and he keeps destroying any possibility of rebuilding any kind of Russian empire. Let's imagine that tomorrow evening, or even morning, we don't know, he invades Ukraine. What else? What else? How will he run this country? How will he assure the Ukrainian people a good standard of life? How could he seduce this population which now wants their country to belong to NATO? 7 years ago, just before the annexation of Crimea, a huge majority of Ukrainian people were against any idea of belonging to NATO. Now a huge majority of Ukrainian people want their country to belong to NATO. Bravo, Mr. Putin. What a success for Russia. What a success for Russian national interest, and let's not speak for the European stability and peace. And third, this same fellow, supposed to be strong and clever, but actually weak and blind, had convinced the European countries, the member states of the European Union, to diversify their energy supplies. And so it will be more and more difficult in the years to come for Russia to sell their gas and oil to our countries, I mean the countries of the European Union. And so what could he do? Yes, he could deepen his alliance with Mr. Xi Jinping. But what about an alliance between a small cat and a big elephant like China? Even a 5 or 6 or 7 years old child would understand the result of such an alliance. Russia would become completely dependent on China and simply a vassal of China. In this situation, the Russian people and even the Russian governing elites, I mean both the oligarchs and the Siloviki, wouldn't like it, because Russia doesn't belong to Asia, but does belong to Europe. Russia is a European country by its culture and by history. And so, Mr. Putin, you're not a good president of the Russian Federation. And actually, your policy is very harming for your own country. And more people in Russia, among the Russian people, will understand that. And the situation could become, for you, and unfortunately for Russia also, more and more difficult. So, on one hand, I told you that, and we share, unfortunately, the same views. The situation is very, very dark and frightening because a real war could happen. I'm not sure of that. Nobody is sure of that, but it could happen at the very heart of the continent, Europe. But on the other hand, Mr. Putin is not stronger and stronger, but weaker and weaker. Thank you.
Now, merci mille fois. Very, very insightful and thought-provoking elaboration. It just begs the question whether you would rather have a dangerous idiot or a dangerous genius at work. And maybe we will leave that question to the Q&A session afterwards, because for now, it is my great pleasure to welcome, last but not least, our last speaker, Dr. Jamie Shear, who is a former senior NATO official and professor of strategy and security at the University of Exeter. He is currently an associate fellow on the International Security Program at Chatham House and president of the Center for War Studies at Southern Denmark University. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everybody. And let me first of all thank Carol and Chris, Liberal International too, for giving me the opportunity to participate in the debate this evening. I'm aware that I'm the fourth speaker. That means two things. The good part is that often people only remember what the last speaker said, so I'll try to be good. But the other thing, of course, is that when you're the fourth speaker, you're in the typical situation where everything that needs to be said has already been said by everybody except me. And so clearly your sandwiches have been stolen from in front of your eyes and you're condemned to make many of the same points. But with those caveats, let me at least give you my take on the current crisis. I think the first point I would like to make, and I'll try to be brief because I'm aware that you have waited long enough to start with the Q&A session. The first point I would make is that we didn't have to be where we are today. There was no fatality in NATO and Russia returning to a pattern of confrontation at the end of the Cold War. I know from my years sitting in the NATO-Russia Council and working on the Russia file at NATO that we tried very hard to have a different outcome. There was a period, for example, in the 1990s when Russia seemed seriously interested in joining NATO. I indeed participated in a meeting with President Putin in the Kremlin in the early part of this century, when he quizzed the NATO Secretary General for quite a long time about what it would take for Russia to be a member of the alliance. He seemed generally interested. I remember the times that I was the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council group dealing with terrorism, and where we had excellent cooperation for many years with the Russians, working on things like container security, the protection of cruise liners in the Baltic Sea, or the protection of major sporting events. We cooperated very actively with Russia in Afghanistan, where we shared a common cause in trying to prevent extremists coming back to power there. We also cooperated with Russia in dealing with piracy in the Gulf of Aden. And I recall happy times going to places like Bosnia and Kosovo, where I had the privilege of actually inspecting Russian military units that were joining NATO in the peacekeeping operations there. Genuine peacekeeping operations, not the ones that Putin today is talking about when it comes to the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So there was a different outcome. We were able for a while to enlarge NATO. while also having good cooperation with Russia, and also to make it clear to Russia that the enlargement of NATO did not pose a military threat to it. In fact, quite the opposite. I do recall complaints from some of our new allies after they joined NATO at the tail end of the 1990s that they were expecting American tanks or British squaddies to arrive on their territories immediately after they joined NATO, and that didn't happen. NATO in 1997 gave an explicit guarantee that we would not put nuclear weapons, of course not, nor station combat forces or infrastructure on the territory of the new allied member states, as long as peaceful conditions in Europe prevailed. So NATO enlargement was more an exercise of Eastern Europe moving west rather than the NATO military structures moving east. We made it clear that Russia had its place in the Euro-Atlantic community. Second point is Ukraine. Russia has signed up to a number of agreements going back to the end of the 1990s, where it explicitly recognizes the sovereignty of all of the states that emerged from Europe after the Cold War. It certainly then did not sort of declare Ukraine as some kind of fictitious state that had no right to exist. In the Bucharest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine agreed to hand its nuclear weapons over to Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians again explicitly guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine within its then frontiers. They accepted on numerous occasions the right of countries to choose to be part of an alliance if they wished to do so. That was the free choice in the new Europe. Russia explicitly renounced the use of force in settling international disputes within the Euro-Atlantic architecture. And indeed, if today we are in a more difficult situation, then President Putin, I think, has to acknowledge that he is largely the cause of that because, for example, countries like Ukraine were committed to neutrality back in 2014 before Russia annexed Crimea. They weren't actively seeking NATO membership. Ukraine was much more on a trajectory to join, like Sweden and Finland, the European Union rather than NATO. It was only in response to Russian military action and the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then later on the penetration of Russian forces into the Donbass area of Ukraine, that then Kiev changed its mind, obviously because it felt the hot breath of Russia on the back of its neck and suddenly turned towards NATO. So sometimes I think of President Putin as the kind of pyrotechnic firefighter who's always rushing to douse fires, or trying to, which he himself has largely created. The third issue is that this is not just a crisis over Ukraine. Even though that is the proximate focus of our attention tonight, with the question of will Russia invade or not. What Putin is trying to do is to reopen the entire European security system that we've spent the last 30 years painfully trying to build up since the end of the Cold War, where small countries or medium-sized countries don't have to be part of somebody else's sphere of influence, where history is not destiny, where we look to the future rather than replay the false historical narratives of the past. What Putin is actually doing is to say that Russia's perceived security interests come before everybody else's. And it reminds me a little bit of what Henry Kissinger once said about the Soviet Union, when he said that absolute security for the Soviet Union means absolute insecurity for everybody else. It's almost as if Putin is asking sort of 50 odd plus countries of Europe to sacrifice their security and to rearrange all of their security ties and links simply to please Russia. What also worries me is this sort of sense that a country's borders are fluid, that Russia has a claim on territories simply because 200 years ago, at the time of the Tsarist Empire, it happened to be in control of those territories. I mean, if we followed this logic in Europe, then Germany would stake a claim to Alsace-Lorraine tomorrow. the French would claim the Netherlands, which in 1810, at the height of the Napoleonic Empire, was called the Batavian Republic of France. The UK would restake a claim to Bordeaux and Aquitaine. You get my point. There would be no end to the instability this would cause. We can't simply choose the historical model from the past that represents our greatest extent of empire and say, aha, that's now our new defining standard, and that's what we're going to go back to. If Putin gets away with this, if NATO accepted his terms, which of course NATO is not willing to do, it would mean that NATO forces would have to withdraw from 50% of NATO territory. Half the membership which joined at the end of the Cold War, they would have an unprotected second-class membership of NATO. And indeed, the word would soon get out that if NATO was not really credible in giving a security guarantee to Poland, it wouldn't be credible in giving a security guarantee to France, Spain, Germany, or the United States either. It would mean that Russia's giving a security guarantee to Russia took precedence in NATO to giving security guarantees to NATO's own allies and member states, and it would mean a de facto Russian veto over everything that NATO was trying to do. So we cannot simply unravel the entire European security order in the belief that it would somehow bring us lasting peace. There's been no evidence in the past when we have tried to stabilize the situation and once again talk to Russia or offer arms control negotiations or other confidence building measures that Putin is happy and renounces further steps at imperial expansion. So my fourth point is no quick fix. I hear a number of academics and policymakers say, oh, well, you know, let's take away the prospects of Ukraine joining NATO. Let's agree for Ukraine to be neutralized. Well, that would be a terrible sacrifice of all of our principles. And indeed, I doubt any more than it was possible in 1938 or 1939 that that quick fix would bring us lasting peace. I think very quickly you'll see Putin going beyond Ukraine to put pressure on the Baltics. After all, they were part of the Tsarist Empire too, yes. On Finland, which was part of the Tsarist Empire until 1905, or on Poland, which was partitioned by Russia 3 times in the 18th century and only regained its independence in 1918. Frankly, there would be no end to it whatsoever. So what's the way out? Well, previous speakers, of course, have discussed this in great depth, and I think many of the good points have been made. The first thing is stick to our principles and stay united. What Putin is trying to do first and foremost is create rifts and divisions in our ranks. He thinks we're weak. He thinks we'll give into pressure, that we'll give up sooner or later. We have got to be as steadfast and as tenacious as he is in staying united. So far, frankly, I've been very encouraged by the way in which the United States has engaged its allies. The US has organized more than 150 meetings over the last 6 weeks with its European allies. American officials have been in Europe all of the time. NATO has been meeting, the EU has been meeting, there have been all kinds of extraordinary meetings. Everybody has kept everybody in touch with what they're doing. It's all been part of a coordinated plan. There's been no freelancing by individual countries thinking that somehow they can act as mediator and achieve a shady compromise peace, which the rest of us will then be forced to accept. So Western unity is absolutely key. The second thing is that as our policy is sanctions, because we've made it clear that as Ukraine is not a NATO member, we are not going to defend Ukraine militarily, although that doesn't mean to say that we can't support Ukraine. I'll come to this in a moment. But as sanctions is our policy, then we've got to make sanctions work. It's no good saying, you know, we're going to respond with sanctions and then we dither. The sanctions are weak, like a pea shooter in a blizzard, but they're things that the Russians would have already sort of cashed in and prepared for, where they feel that they can easily ride out the storm. If we've promised massive and intrusive sanctions, then they've got to be massive and intrusive and kick in immediately. Otherwise, they're not going to act as a deterrent if we still have time before Putin invades Ukraine, or they're not going to act as punishment if we have to use them to retaliate after. So we've got to make sure that this time we don't simply have a few symbolic sanctions on Russian oligarchs who can no longer fly into London and access their expensive apartments or visit their favorite football clubs, but we've got to obviously target the Russian financial sector. We've got to target technology imports into Russia, the ability of Russia to refinance debt. And indeed, one of the key things is Germany has got to put the Nord Stream 2 pipeline into that mix, because the Russians don't believe that Germany will do that. And if Germany does, then I think Putin will be generally surprised at Western and German resolve. The third thing we've got to do is help the Ukrainians. We're not going to defend them with Russian soldiers, but we should give them the means whereby they can defend themselves. This effort has started somewhat belatedly. Many allies like the US, the UK have given pieces of equipment, anti-tank weapons, anti-air weapons, radars, materiel, the sort of things that can help the Ukrainians. The best antidote for Putin wanting to invade Ukraine is that his forces get a bloody nose and take significant casualties, as they did in Afghanistan, in thinking that they can occupy and subdue another country. Many of the Russian soldiers are conscripts. I don't for 1 minute think their heart is in it when it comes to fighting their Ukrainian cousins. And if the price for Putin goes up and it doesn't become a cakewalk, the Ukrainians show every willingness to be prepared to resist and defend their homeland, then we've got to help them to do it. Of course, Putin will argue that that's a piece of Western aggression, but not doing it is not going to stop him being aggressive vis-a-vis Ukraine or vis-a-vis us. So the sin of omission is worse here than the sin of commission. Finally, we need to reduce our vulnerabilities. Unfortunately for me, the lesson of the last few weeks is that Russia as a problem is not going to go away. It's been building up, we know, for several years to come. And therefore, we can expect, even if there is a lull in the fighting, or if Putin simply recognizes the independence of the two republics in Donbass and then sends the rest of his forces back home, claiming a sort of Pyrrhic victory there. Nonetheless, his basic hostility towards the West, his attempts to undermine the West through all kinds of stratagems, like interference in elections, cyber attacks, corrupt money. We know the techniques by now. All of that's not going to go away. And we have therefore to take a serious look at how we reduce our vulnerabilities vis-a-vis Russia, trying to reduce the share of Russian gas in the EU market below the 40% would be a very wise step to take right now by diversifying our energy supplies, and looking at the protection of our critical infrastructure, cleaning up our financial markets vis-a-vis Russian dirty money, all of the kind of things that are going to make it easier for us to adopt hard sanctions, precisely because the cost to ourselves will be less if we reduce our vulnerabilities in the future. Like in the Cold War, we're going to be in this for a long haul. Mr. Putin is likely to be in power for another decade at the very, very least. And it's difficult to believe that he's going to change back to a cooperative stance now. That doesn't mean to say that we're pledged to unremitting hostility vis-a-vis Russia. Not at all. If the window opens, for example, to conduct serious talks about military transparency, arms control, limitations on exercises, the sort of things that would reassure Russia about NATO and NATO about Russia, that sort of thing is worth doing. But we have to divest ourselves of the illusion that Russia is going to magically find its way back to democracy, that it's truly interested in a partnership with the West. It certainly isn't, or that making concessions will be reciprocated on the other side. We have a challenge from Russia as an authoritarian state. And just like the Cold War, we have to have the staying power and the policies peacefully, through deterrence, to see it through until such time as Russians once again turn their backs on authoritarianism and decide to take a gamble on a brighter democratic future. This happened twice in the 20th century, once in 1917, of course, after the March Russian Revolution, the government of Alexander Kerensky, where at least for 6 months, we thought that Russia would go in a more constitutional, parliamentary direction. It was snuffed out in October 1917 by the Bolshevik Revolution, and the last democratic elections in Russia took place in January 1918. Then it came back in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Yalta years, which were chaotic, but which at least saw Russians travel to the West, get on the internet, become increasingly prosperous as they were able to start their own businesses. In terms of a democratic Russia and prosperity, the 25 years of the Russian democracy after 1991, before Putin snuffed it all out, were probably some of the best in their history. That's now gone for a second time. But we say, where I come from, third time lucky, and we have to have the staying power until democracy comes back to Russia, and simply hope that this time round its roots are deeper and its longevity is greater than what we saw in the 20th century. Anyway, those are my comments. Thank you very much for listening. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, you get to ask us some questions and to engage the debate.
Thank you very, very much, Jamie. Julie had to leave us because she has other engagement at the House of Commons, and she did tell us in advance she would have to leave at 7. Everyone else is still there. I don't know, Jamie, what time you are set to arrive, but we try to keep you on for the questions if you can at all make it. We have half an hour. We have received in advance of this session in writing a number of questions, and I feel that it is fair for people who did send these questions that we should go through these first. So I will, in no particular order, and I'm afraid without having time to name the identity of the questioners in every case, just very briefly go through this and invite people in as far as they can stay on. And I understand, Jamie, if you can't, don't worry, please, to answer this. So the first question is, was it not an error by Western powers to rush into offering NATO membership to former Warsaw Pact members as soon as the Soviet Union fell, thus giving a potentially hostile signal to the new Russian Federation? I'm looking at Bernard in the first instance, but I would very much welcome all the other speakers to come in on that question.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to say so, but I'm afraid there is an historical mistake in the question, because actually the Western countries, the old members of NATO, didn't rush to convince the countries coming from the Soviet bloc to enter in NATO. It was just the opposite. Those countries rushed to NATO to obtain a membership in NATO because they were extremely afraid of a counter-reaction by Russia after a few years. And actually, the policies of Mr. Putin make them right. And of course, one could think that if those countries hadn't joined NATO, the policy of Mr. Putin and Russia wouldn't be the same. Maybe yes, okay. But the fact is that the Baltic countries are safer than Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, while the Baltic countries are member of the Atlantic Alliance. And so what could we say? We could say, that's my opinion. It's not shared by everybody, I have to tell you, but I will tell you my own opinion. The big mistake made by the Western countries, but also by the Russian people, was 35 years ago, not to believe Mr. Gorbachev when he said that he wanted to make an end to the Cold War and to democratize Russia and to re-give their freedom to the countries of Central Europe. If we had believed the sincerity of Mr. Gorbachev, because he was completely sincere, we wouldn't be in such a situation. We wouldn't be in such a situation because it would have been possible to reorganize the stability of a new continent. But we ended the Cold War without any real new agreement between the European countries, and by the European countries, I mean including Russia, because Russia belongs. Some people don't like this reality, but Russia belongs, geographically speaking, to the European continent, and so Russia is a European country.
I couldn't agree more with that last statement. Thank you, Bernard. Odysseas, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Jimmy gave a real good overview of why this could have ended differently than what it is today. So I have nothing to add. Let's move on to the other questions. Okay,
well, we have quite a lot of questions. So could I ask our speakers to be brief, please, in their answers? But the second question actually is very interesting as well. How far should we be prepared to go militarily to protect Ukraine? How close is the nuclear tripwire? Odysseas, do you want to have a first go at that one?
Well, we do know that Putin was doing nuclear readiness exercises recently, so he is clearly saber-rattling with the nuclear weapons, hoping that it will be actually a deterrence for the West and a threat of what Russia is capable for in order to compel concessions. So he's already using nuclear to compel both Ukraine and the West to achieve concessions. I think he may place nuclear weapons in Crimea, where, from what I know, he is restoring the old nuclear base in Balaclava. Of those, we are almost having a historical trip now, like back to the past, just thinking about it. But I think that it's unfortunate, but I think they are prepared to use every blackmail possible. I would imagine, short of actually using nuclear. That's why it's important that even when hostilities will likely to commence, there is a back channel of the military deconfliction that was actually in place in Syria, and it depends on what will be happening on the ground. I'm sure there were a lot of discussion on contingency planning and a boost up of Ukrainian defenses in case there is, for example, the use of air bombardments or heavy artillery against Ukrainian cities. But Ukraine clearly needs assistance, for example, to supply Ukrainian territorial defense units, which were established between December of last year and this year, that include at this point 10,000 volunteers who are ready to mount resistance in case Russia takes new Ukrainian territory. So Ukraine has enough soldiers to defend Ukraine. The question is equipment, intelligence, and electronic warfare, to perhaps more drones. And this is what Turkey does, is supplies drones, for example, to disable some of the Russian targets. So these are some of the things I can say on the military front.
Thank you, Odysseas. Bernard, is there anything you would like to add to that question? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was mute. No, it's okay. It's okay for me.
Thank you very much, Odysseas. Let's go to the next question. It seems that Russia is attempting, by its aggressive behavior towards Ukraine, and in particular at the moment in the West, to show Washington that it is a power to be reckoned with once more. Could there also could there also be read into its actions a message to Beijing to lay off its claim to currently Russian-held territory in the Far East? Did you understand the question?
Yeah, I think, but there's a mistake in the question. The person thought about Japan. That there's territorial dispute between Japan and Russia. I'm not sure there's territorial dispute between China and Russia. Not that I'm aware. Maybe Bernard knows something. But, but I think there is a point that is actually a good point. By bullying Ukraine and by creating this crisis, Putin gets himself attention at the global table, right? He almost brought a little chair, put next to it, because we in a way, one way or the other, talking about the bipolar superpowers, US and China, or US a declining power, China rising power, but nobody talks about Russia. And I think Bernard very poignantly described why Russia is weak, and the size of Russian economy is the size of Italy. So clearly Russia can hardly compete neither in nanotechnology. It's basically the carbohydrates export state that lives on high oil prices and funnels money out of Russian public budget to hide in a tax haven jurisdiction, including in the city of London and Denver and Cyprus. So I think that this crisis is created exactly for that purpose, to get a seat at the table by bullying neighbors.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I'm not sure about the question because unfortunately we don't have a live questioning function here, but I think that answered it very well. The next question is the following. Since Tsarist times, Russia and then the Soviet Union has always feared encirclement by united foreign powers acting against what it perceives as its national interest. Is it therefore not surprising that eventually there could be a conflict in some form if NATO continued to expand to the east? Bernard, can I give you the first chance to answer this one? Interesting question.
You know, it's a very complicated situation because, of course, no country wants a military alliance dominated by another country to go to its border. I have to tell you frankly, if Switzerland decided democratically out of his sovereignty to join a military alliance dominated by China, I would be quite worried, and I would expect my government, my army, my secret services to fight this decision. But that's one point. And the other points are that the countries which used to belong to the Soviet Empire and to the Soviet Union rightly want to be independent and not to belong to this empire anymore. This is quite logical. This is quite logical. And the threat in the reality is not coming from NATO, but from Russia. As far as we know, the military people stationed along the Ukrainian border are not American nor European. I mean, by European belonging to the European Union. They are Russian. Annexation of Crimea wasn't made by NATO, but by Russia. And the Atlantic Alliance never organized any annexation of any part of the Russian territory. So let's not forget the reality of the situation. The threat is Russian. Maybe and certainly yes, actually. There was in the recent history, or in history, very complicated problems. Maybe we can understand the unease of the Russian elite and the Russian people when they see NATO approaching their own borders. But I'm sorry, if you don't want my Russian friend, my dear Mr. Putin, if you don't want Ukraine to wish to belong to NATO, don't annex parts of the Ukrainian territory. Don't make them hostile to you, because you made them hostile to you.
Thank you, Bernard. That's an interesting point. I can see Odysseus is burning to add something to this. Please do keep it brief. We have lots more questions.
Very brief. Soviet Union has been dissolved, but Russian Empire is still collapsing. Please keep this in your perspective. Empires don't dissolve or collapse overnight. And second, Ukraine's territory was aggressed and Crimea was annexed when Ukrainian constitution included non-bloc neutral status. And if you follow now Russian president's statement about the recognition of parts of Ukrainian territory as independent states, he gives another history lesson where he says it's Lenin and Stalin that created Ukraine, implying Putin wants to undo their creation. So it's we are dealing with a very dangerous revisionist regime with a nuclear power.
Thank you, Alicia. Sorry, my own internet connection seems to be hanging there in threads, but I try to continue. Please can I ask our speakers to keep their answers, if at all possible, to 1 minute, because I'm really keen for us to get through as many questions as possible. We only have 13 minutes left. So the next question is, with the situation as it is right now, talks have intensified in non-NATO EU countries regarding the potential to join the alliance. Do you have any specific considerations to raise about this? For instance, do you believe that an expansion of NATO would inevitably escalate the situation even more, possibly to the point of an armed conflict within the EU borders? Alicia.
Well, all I can say is that, as Bernard said, Putin's tactic is reaching strategically opposite outcomes, and if it's Sweden that now feels threatened in its borders, and Russia is, doing very dangerous exercises around its islands, Sweden will decide what fits best also for its security, and that's why I think I think it may escalate, because honestly, I do believe that for Putin is not enough, again, just to threaten Ukraine. If he is up for a revision of global rules, he needs also to threaten directly NATO periphery. And that means he is keeping his troops in Belarus, right? As it has been said, indefinitely until situation in Ukraine improves. This is the evidence to the possibility of escalation and direct confrontation between NATO and Russian Federation.
Thank you, Bernard.
No, nothing to add. This is clear and right.
Thank you as well. I'm going to take the executive decision of picking some questions, rather because we don't have time to go to all of them. But here's one that I think is quite topical today. And this question I would like to ask the attitude of the speakers to the plan of settlement in Donbass proposed by our sister party Yalta and its leader Grigory Yavlinsky in his presidential election campaign in Russia in 2018. You may have seen there was a tweet about it today. And the question says, anyway, peace must be installed. We hope that this plan will work. I don't know if you have seen it. It's a 10-point plan. Odysseus, if you have seen it, would you like to comment?
I'll just comment briefly. I think the key elements of this plan, for those who have not seen it, it includes the international administration of temporarily occupied territories, the peacekeeping mission, and the disarmament of illegally occupied, illegally armed formations. I think that Ukrainians, and I know this from public opinion, support international peacekeeping mission. Over 60% Ukrainians believe that it would be a good way forward. I also know that Russia was blocking exactly that same motion that was proposed also by former President Poroshenko to set up a peacekeeping mission, international. So the plan is good. The problem is that Kremlin has no will to move a single point in that plan, and judged by the Putin's decree today, we see that it's the end of any existing format, and whatever will emerge today, we still don't know. But I am sorry to say, a lot of it will depend on the outcome on the battlefield.
Thank you, Alicia. If it's okay, we will now move to questions from our live audience. And the first one is from Councillor Robin Ashby about the very recent announcement that Russia is recognizing the oblasts in eastern Ukraine, as well as giving a pretext for invasion. Will this lead to them being absorbed into Russia as Crimea, or maintained as a mini buffer between Russia and Crimea? And what is the outlook for Belarus as an independent state? Bernard, would you like to have a first go at that?
Well, formally speaking, Belarus will remain an independent state, but it is already a completely dependent state because Mr. Lukashenko has no money, has no possibility to counterbalance the influence of Mr. Putin, because he needs Mr. Putin to fight his own people and to fight the wish of his own people to get freedom and democracy in Belarus. And so what we see now is Mr. Putin trying to rebuild the former Russian Empire, at least with the three Slavic countries, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. But he's trying to do that by force. If he invades tomorrow or in the coming days, if he invades Ukraine, let's not be naive. He will arrest, kill, and kill opponents and freedom fighters. And he will do that to prevent a real resistance from the Ukrainian people. And so it will be the beginning of a real war between the people of Ukraine and the Russian power. This resistance will be, I hope so, and I do think so, will be supported by the Western democracies. And so the situation will be frightening for everybody and absolutely horrible for the Ukrainian people. So those days are very, very dark. But is Mr. Putin so sure to win by those means? Maybe he thinks so, but I don't. I think he will lose. I think he will lose. And I think that his policies, again, are completely contrary to national, historical, and cultural interest of Russia. Because a tête-à-tête between Russia and China is certainly not in the national interest of Russia.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Odysseus, I saw you nod. Would you like to add anything?
Let's go ahead. If there are any questions, it's fine.
Okay, then I think the next question, which was about Putin's long-term and short-term, I think we have answered this overall. So I will skip to the next question, which is by Philip Goldenberg. Of course, Putin's execrable behavior is to be condemned, but it is not the real choice between a Ukraine in NATO with sufficient external military resources to make it too expensive to invade, or Finland-like neutrality. I'm not sure I understood this question 100%, but maybe you did. Odysseus.
Well, I think we already covered the question of Ukraine's neutrality as an option, and I personally believe it's not an option. Ukrainian citizens believe it's not an option. It's simply because, as we said, Putin denies Ukraine as a sovereign state, and it's not. He will not remain. He will not allow Ukraine to maintain even neutral. He wants to have a political control over Ukraine, its resources, people. That is why it's a non-option.
Thank you. And I think the next question we've also partly covered, which is by Wendy Curl Pope, which she asked, how much of Putin's actions towards Ukraine and previously to Crimea is to divert attention from Russia's many problems, economic, social, and demographic, falling population, and make himself more Tsar-like? Bernard?
Yes, certainly that Putin wants to divert his countrymen and countrywoman, country person. I don't know how to say that. Certainly he wants to divert them from the real problems. But I think this is a pure illusion, because the Russian people is not ready to go into war with Ukraine or with anybody now. They want to get good schools, good hospitals, good roads, good trains, good plants, good factories. And they don't have anything of that, because Mr. Putin didn't care during 20 years to rebuild a national industry, to rebuild a national economy. Russia is a pure Saudi Arabia with oil and natural resources, but with no industry. And so Russia is quite powerful, military speaking, but this is a very poor country. And the discontent is growing and growing among the Russian people. And I would say that for Mr. Putin, actually, this is the beginning of the end. And of course, this end could be long and horrible, but this is certainly not a beginning. This is the beginning of the end.
Thank you, Bernard. These are wonderful words to close off the discussion, but we have 1 minute left, and the next question is from one of my favorite organizations here in the UK called Unlock Democracy. And if you permit me, because it is directly to Odysseus, this will be our last question. Can you make it really brief, please, Odysseus? Because we do need to finish on time. The question is the following. Odysseus said, diplomacy is about delivering serious messages, not giving Putin photo ops. Could this charge be made of Johnson and Truss as well? What contribution could the UK government make to diplomacy? I realize that neither of you is a UK politician, and we haven't got Julie here anymore. but I like the question and would love for you to have a go at this, Odysseus, since it was addressed to you.
Well, absolutely. I think we are actually hearing quite resolute messages from the UK government on Ukraine. And just to tell you, to liven up a little bit our conversation, because it's dark, 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 as Bernard was saying, it's dark indeed. But thanks to the political and military support of the UK to Ukraine, people are saying perhaps Ukraine should join the Commonwealth rather than the European Union, because this is where we have a true partner. So you see, Ukraine is looking for solutions. Where is the family of countries that is understanding the same threat perception of Russia as Ukraine? And I think UK's leadership currently and the Commonwealth and the Lords clearly demonstrate the same threat perception of what a disturbing and disruptive actor Russia is. And these messages, I've heard them, Liz Truss delivering them in Moscow. She was very blunt. She was actually humiliated to a certain degree because of her lack of knowledge of geography, but that is the fault of UK education, I must say. I've seen how my son was studying here. I mean, he could not understand countries in the European Union. So what UK could do actually as a signatory of the Budapest Memorandum and the permanent member of the UN Security Council is to work closely with Ukraine, like it does, on convening, for example, as today Ukrainian Foreign Minister proposed, the UN Permanent Security Council plus Turkey and plus Germany to discuss what is going on in Europe. So backing for initiatives like that to seek these alternative platforms would be very useful.
Odysseus, Bernard, thank you so much for bearing with us. I'm so sorry. I know there are more questions in the Q&A. I know there were a few more questions also in the chat, but we have reached the end of our 90 minutes. And it leaves me just to say thank you also to our previous speakers, Julie and Jamie. It was a shame we couldn't hear everything Jamie was saying, so I will try to get him to maybe record some of his thoughts, and maybe we'll be able to publish this. I can't make promises on behalf of the technical wizards and organizers, but I think that would be extremely useful. Because I feel that all of our speakers had to contribute really valuable insights from very different perspectives, which I really, really enjoyed. Thank you for those of you who dialed in and those who posted questions beforehand for your fantastic questions. And of course, a huge thank you to the Paddy Ashdown Forum, as always, for helping to make this event happen for everyone on the executives of Liberal International British groups and Lib Dem European group, who were as always helping to make this happen. I do hope that next time we speak about Ukraine and we speak about Russia, we will do so in the context of a détente, of a ray of hope, in the absence of a war. I'm sure the problem will not have gone away completely, but for now, it leaves me to just wish you all a peaceful evening and a peaceful coming weeks and months. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much, Irina. Bye-bye.
And thank you.
Bye-bye, Bernard. Bye, Robert.
Thank you. Bye-bye.